Number 1. Derek Chauvin. On May 25th, 2020, a cell phone video changed the world. 9 minutes and 29 seconds of footage that would ignite protests across the globe, topple monuments, and send shockwaves through every corner of society. At the center of it all was a Minneapolis police officer whose name would become synonymous with police brutality and systemic injustice. Derek Michael Chauvin was born in 1976 in Oakdale, Minnesota. He grew up in the suburbs of St. Paul, the product of a broken home after his parents divorced when he was 7. His mother worked as a housewife, his father in corporate America. Nothing about his childhood suggested the infamy that awaited him. After high school, Chauvin worked as a prep cook at McDonald's before joining the U.S. Army Reserves. In 2001, at age 25, he joined the Minneapolis Police Department. Over the next 19 years, he'd become a veteran officer with 18 complaints filed against him, only one resulting in discipline, a letter of reprimand. He married twice, the second time to a Laotian refugee who became a realtor. To neighbors, he seemed unremarkable, quiet, reserved, professional. That Monday in May started as a routine shift. Around 8 o'clock in the evening, Cup Foods, a convenience store in South Minneapolis, called 911. An employee reported that someone had used a counterfeit $20 bill to buy cigarettes. The suspect was still outside, sitting in a blue SUV. Officers Thomas Lane and J. Alexander Quing arrived first. They approached the vehicle where George Floyd, a 46-year-old black man, sat in the driver's seat. Within minutes, the situation escalated. Floyd appeared resistant as officers attempted to place him in the squad car. He said he was claustrophobic, that he couldn't breathe. That's when Chauvin and his partner, Tu Thao, arrived as backup. Chauvin, the senior officer on scene, took control. What happened next was captured by multiple bystanders on their phones. Chauvin placed his knee on Floyd's neck as Floyd lay face down on the pavement, hands cuffed behind his back. For 9 minutes and 29 seconds, Chauvin maintained that position. Floyd repeatedly said he couldn't breathe, at least 27 times. He called for his mother. Bystanders pleaded with Chauvin to check Floyd's pulse, to let him up. A 17-year-old girl filmed it all. Thao kept the growing crowd back. Lane asked twice if they should roll Floyd onto his side. Chauvin said no. Even after Floyd stopped moving, stopped speaking, Chauvin's knee remained. An ambulance arrived. Paramedics checked for a pulse and found none. Only then did Chauvin remove his knee. George Floyd was pronounced dead at the hospital an hour later. The video went viral within hours. By the next morning, all 4 officers were fired. Protests erupted in Minneapolis, then spread to every major city in America, then worldwide. Buildings burned. The 3rd precinct was abandoned and set ablaze. The National Guard deployed. Within days, Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison took over the case. On May 29th, 4 days after Floyd's death, Chauvin was arrested and charged with 3rd-degree murder and manslaughter. The charges would later be upgraded to include 2nd-degree murder. The trial began on March 8, 2021, in a heavily fortified courthouse in downtown Minneapolis. The city was a fortress. Concrete barriers, razor wire, National Guard troops on every corner. Prosecutor Jerry Blackwell opened by telling jurors, "You can believe your eyes." The state's case was straightforward. They played the video. They called the teenage girl who filmed it. They brought in Floyd's girlfriend, who testified about his struggle with opioid addiction, but also his humanity. They called the off-duty firefighter who begged to check Floyd's pulse. Perhaps most damaging were the law enforcement experts, including the Minneapolis police chief himself, who testified that Chauvin's use of force violated department policy and his training. Dr. Martin Tobin, a pulmonologist, explained in precise detail how Floyd died from low oxygen, not from drugs or underlying health conditions. Imagine sitting in that jury box, watching your city burn outside, knowing the weight of your decision. Chauvin's defense attorney, Eric Nelson, argued that Floyd died from a combination of heart disease, drug use, fentanyl, and methamphetamine were found in his system, and the stress of the arrest. He pointed to the hostile crowd as a distraction. He suggested Chauvin was following his training, but the prosecution countered every point. The medical examiner ruled it a homicide, death caused by cardiopulmonary arrest, complicating law enforcement subdual, restraint, and neck compression. 3 weeks of testimony, 14 days of deliberation. On April 20th, 2021, the verdict came down. Guilty on all 3 counts: second-degree unintentional murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. Chauvin showed no visible reaction as the verdict was read. Outside, Minneapolis exhaled. On June 25th, 2021, Judge Peter Cahill sentenced Chauvin to 22.5 years in prison, 10 years above the sentencing guideline. The judge cited Chauvin's abuse of a position of trust and authority, and his particular cruelty toward Floyd. Chauvin briefly addressed the court, offering condolences to the Floyd family, but stopping short of an apology. In February 2022, he pleaded guilty to federal charges of violating George Floyd's civil rights and was sentenced to an additional 21 years to run concurrent with his state sentence. He's currently serving his time in a federal prison in Arizona in protective custody. The other 3 officers, Lane, Queng, and Thao, were also convicted on federal civil rights charges. Lane and Queng received shorter sentences. Thao, who held back the crowd, received 3.5 years. Derek Chauvin will be eligible for parole in his 60s. George Floyd's daughter was 6 years old when she lost her father. The Minneapolis Police Department underwent massive reforms. Defund the police became a rallying cry. Statues fell, murals rose, and a 19-year veteran cop became the face of a reckoning that America still hasn't fully processed. Sometimes history turns on 9 minutes captured on a cell phone, and nothing is ever the same again. Number 2, Michael Slager. Imagine pulling someone over for a broken taillight and, minutes later, becoming the subject of a viral video that would destroy your career, your freedom, and your reputation. That's exactly what happened to North Charleston police officer Michael Slager on the morning of April 4th, 2015, a traffic stop that would end in death and ignite a firestorm over police shootings of unarmed black men. Michael Thomas Slager was born in 1981 in Florida, but grew up in South Carolina. By all accounts, he was an all-American kid, played sports, stayed out of trouble, had a tight-knit family. After high school, he joined the U.S. Coast Guard, serving for several years before transitioning into law enforcement. In 2009, he joined the North Charleston Police Department. He was married with a young stepson, expecting his first biological child. Colleagues described him as professional, even-tempered, a solid officer. He'd received a department commendation in 2014 for a traffic stop that led to a drug arrest. Nothing in his record suggested violence. 5 years on the force, no major complaints. To his neighbors and friends, Michael Slager was just another cop doing his job. Until that Saturday morning, when everything changed. It was around 9:30 a.m. when Slager pulled over a Mercedes-Benz with a broken brake light. The driver was Walter Scott, a 50-year-old black man and father of 4. Scott had a warrant out for unpaid child support. He owed around $18,000. What should have been a routine stop quickly went sideways. Scott ran. Slager chased him into a vacant lot behind a pawn shop. Witnesses would later say they heard a taser being deployed. Then gunshots, 8 of them in rapid succession. Walter Scott fell face down in the grass. He was unarmed. A bystander, Fiden Santana, captured the shooting on his cell phone from about 30 feet away. The video showed Slager firing at Scott's back as he ran away. After Scott collapsed, Slager approached, handcuffed him, then walked back to retrieve something, later identified as his taser, and dropped it near Scott's body. Officers performed CPR, but Scott was pronounced dead at the scene. The initial police report stated that Scott had taken Slager's taser during a scuffle, and Slager feared for his life. But the video told a different story. Fighting Santana didn't immediately release the video. He was scared, unsure what would happen. But after hearing the official police narrative, he gave the footage to Scott's family, who handed it to their attorney. 2 days after the shooting, the video went public. The response was immediate and explosive. North Charleston's mayor called it a bad decision by Slager. The police chief said he was sickened by what he saw. Within hours, Slager was fired and arrested. He was charged with murder. The video showed what the initial report tried to conceal, that Scott was running away, unarmed, when Slager fired. The debate over police use of force was already raging after the deaths of Eric Garner, Michael Brown, and Tamir Rice. Walter Scott's name joined that tragic list. The case went to trial in October 2016. Slager's defense attorney argued that he acted in self-defense, that Scott had grabbed his taser during a struggle, and that Slager feared Scott would come back and use it against him. The prosecution countered that Scott was running away and posed no immediate threat. They played the video over and over. They brought in ballistics experts, forensic analysts, and Scott's family members. The jury deliberated for days. Then came the stunning result: a hung jury. One juror refused to convict, saying he couldn't get beyond the reasonable doubt. The judge declared a mistrial. Protesters filled the streets. Scott's family was devastated. It seemed like Slager might walk free. But then, in a surprise move, federal prosecutors stepped in. They charged Slager with violating Walter Scott's civil rights, along with obstruction of justice for giving false statements. This time, Slager made a different calculation. Facing the possibility of life in prison if convicted at trial, he took a plea deal. In May 2017, he pleaded guilty to the federal civil rights charge. In December of that year, he was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. The judge called the shooting an entirely avoidable tragedy and noted that Slager had lied in his incident report. The state murder charge was dropped as part of the plea agreement. Slager is currently serving his sentence at a federal correctional institution. He'll be eligible for release in his late 50s. Walter Scott's family received a $6.5 million settlement from the city of North Charleston. The city also implemented police reforms, including the use of body cameras for all officers. Fighting Santana, the man who filmed the shooting, became an accidental hero, but also lived in fear of retaliation. He eventually moved away. Michael Slager's case became a textbook example of how cell phone video can challenge official narratives and hold officers accountable. Without that footage, it's hard to say what would have happened. Maybe Slager walks. Maybe Walter Scott's family never gets justice. Instead, the video became irrefutable evidence, and Michael Slager, once a decorated cop, became a convicted felon serving 2 decades behind bars for a decision that took seconds but destroyed multiple lives forever. Number 3, Amber Guyger. Picture this. You come home after a long shift, exhausted, ready to collapse on the couch. You walk into what you think is your apartment, see someone inside, and in a split second of confusion and fear, you make a decision that can never be undone. That's the story Amber Guyger told. But the victim's family, the prosecutors, and eventually a jury saw it very differently. A story not of tragic mistake, but of reckless disregard for human life. Amber Renee Guyger was born in 1988 in the Dallas area. She grew up in a suburb called Arlington, the daughter of a middle-class family. Her mother worked in county government, her father in various jobs. Amber was a cheerleader in high school, popular, outgoing, seemingly destined for a normal life. After graduating, she pursued a career in law enforcement. In 2013, she joined the Dallas Police Department. By 2018, she was a patrol officer with 5 years on the force. She'd received awards for her work, including a Cops Cop Award from the Dallas Police Association. She lived alone in an apartment complex called Southside Flats in the gentrifying area south of downtown Dallas. To those who knew her, she seemed dedicated, hard-working, maybe a little intense. Nothing suggested she'd become the center of one of the most controversial police shootings in recent memory. September 6th, 2018. Amber Guyger finished a nearly 14-hour shift. She was still in uniform. Around 10 o'clock at night, she arrived at her apartment building and parked on the 4th floor of the garage. But she lived on the 3rd floor. According to her later testimony, she was distracted, tired, and mistakenly went to the 4th floor instead. She approached what she thought was her apartment, number 1378. The door was slightly ajar. She pushed it open and saw a figure inside. She would later say she thought it was a burglar. She drew her service weapon and fired twice. The man inside, Botham Jean, a 26-year-old accountant originally from the Caribbean island of St. Lucia, fell to the floor. Only then did Guyger realize she was in the wrong apartment. Botham Jean's apartment was directly above hers, number 1478. He'd been sitting on his couch, eating ice cream, watching TV. He was unarmed. He was in his own home. And now, he was dying. Guyger called 911, hysterical. Responding officers found her performing CPR on Jean, sobbing. He was rushed to the hospital but pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The initial response from Dallas police was measured. Guyger was placed on administrative leave. But as details emerged, public outrage grew. How do you mistake someone else's apartment for your own? The layouts were identical. Yes, but Jean had a red doormat outside his door. Guyger's had none. His door was a different color. And most critically, why did she shoot first and ask questions later? Jean's family, who flew in from St. Lucia, demanded answers. Protesters gathered outside Dallas Police headquarters. 3 days after the shooting, Guyger was arrested and charged with manslaughter. The charge would later be upgraded to murder. The trial began in September 2019, almost exactly 1 year after Jean's death. The courtroom was packed. Jean's mother, Allison Jean, attended every day. The prosecution argued that Guyger was distracted because she'd been texting with her married police partner, with whom she was having an affair. They showed records of sexually explicit messages exchanged that evening. They argued she acted recklessly, failed to assess the situation, and used excessive force. The defense maintained it was a tragic mistake, that Guyger genuinely believed she was in her own apartment and that Jean was an intruder. They pointed to the dim lighting, her exhaustion, the ajar door. Guyger herself took the stand, a risky move. She cried, saying she was terrified, that she thought Jean was lunging at her, but the prosecution hammered her on cross-examination. Why didn't you notice the apartment number? Why didn't you retreat and call for backup? Why shoot to kill? Imagine being a juror, weighing an officer's split-second decision against a man's life. On October 2019, the jury found Amber Guyger guilty of murder. The courtroom erupted. Jean's family wept. Guyger showed little emotion. The next day came the sentencing phase. Prosecutors asked for 28 years, Jean's age plus 2, symbolically the number of shots fired. The defense asked for probation. Jean's younger brother, Brant, gave a victim impact statement. In an extraordinary moment, he told Guyger he forgave her and asked if he could hug her. The judge allowed it. The image of that embrace went viral. The judge sentenced Guyger to 10 years in prison, below the maximum but significant nonetheless. That same judge also hugged Guyger and gave her a Bible, an act that drew criticism for being inappropriate. Amber Guyger is currently serving her sentence at the Mountain View Unit in Gatesville, Texas. She'll be eligible for parole in 2024 after serving 5 years. Botham Jean's family pushed for systemic changes. Dallas named a street after him. The Bose Law was passed in Texas, requiring officers to turn on body cameras during investigations. Guyger's was off that night. Civil suits were settled. But for Jean's family, no amount of money or reform brings him back. Amber Guyger, once a rising officer, is now inmate number 02152596, and Botham Jean, who dreamed of returning to St. Lucia to lead his country, was buried in a plot overlooking the Caribbean Sea. The case left a haunting question that still lingers. If Botham Jean had walked into Amber Guyger's apartment by mistake, would he have lived to explain his error, or would he still have been the one shot dead? Number 4. Jason Van Dyke. For over a year, the city of Chicago held its breath. A video existed, a video that officials desperately wanted to keep hidden. When it finally surfaced, it contradicted everything the police had said and reignited the national conversation on police violence and accountability. At the center was a veteran cop named Jason Van Dyke and a teenager named Laquan McDonald, whose death in 2014 would become a turning point in Chicago's reckoning with its police force. Jason David Van Dyke was born in 1978 and grew up in the Chicago suburbs. He married young, had 2 daughters, and by all accounts was a dedicated father. In 2001, at age 23, he joined the Chicago Police Department. Over the next 13 years, Van Dyke would accumulate a troubling record. 20 complaints filed against him for excessive force, verbal abuse, and other misconduct. Most were dismissed or resulted in no discipline. He'd been involved in numerous use-of-force incidents, more than most officers. Yet, he remained on the streets, patrolling the city's south and west sides. To some, he was a cop doing a tough job in tough neighborhoods. To others, he was a ticking time bomb. On the night of October 20th, 2014, police received calls about a young man breaking into vehicles in a trucking yard on the city's southwest side. The suspect was Laquan McDonald, a 17-year-old black teenager with a troubled past, foster homes, behavioral issues, but also someone who loved to draw and dreamed of a better life. Officers arrived and found McDonald holding a knife. Dashcam footage would later show him walking away from police, not toward them. Multiple units responded. Officers followed McDonald in their vehicles, keeping a safe distance, waiting for backup with a taser. Then Van Dyke and his partner arrived. Within 6 seconds of exiting his vehicle, Van Dyke opened fire. He shot McDonald 16 times in 15 seconds. Most of the shots were fired after McDonald had already collapsed to the pavement. Other officers on the scene did not fire their weapons. McDonald was pronounced dead at the hospital. The initial police reports described the shooting as justified. McDonald had lunged at Van Dyke with the knife, posing a deadly threat. But there was video. Dashcam footage from multiple police vehicles captured the entire encounter, and it showed something very different. McDonald was walking away from police, not lunging. The knife was at his side. When Van Dyke fired, McDonald spun and fell. Van Dyke kept firing. The video was explosive. But the city didn't release it. For 13 months, officials fought to keep it secret, citing the ongoing investigation. Journalists and activists, particularly independent reporter Jamie Calvin and attorney Craig Futterman, pushed for its release. Finally, in November 2015, a judge ordered the city to make it public. On November 24th, the video was released. Chicago erupted. Protests shut down Michigan Avenue. The police superintendent was fired, and Van Dyke was charged with first-degree murder, the first time a Chicago cop had faced such charges for an on-duty incident in decades. The trial didn't begin until September 2018, nearly 4 years after the shooting. The city braced for unrest. Van Dyke's defense team argued that he feared for his life, that McDonald was advancing on him with a knife and refused commands to drop it. They portrayed McDonald as a dangerous, PCP-fueled threat, though toxicology showed only marijuana in his system. The prosecution played the video repeatedly. They called officers who testified that McDonald never posed a threat. A use of force expert said Van Dyke's actions were not justified and not reasonable. The most damaging testimony came from Van Dyke's fellow officers, who admitted McDonald was not a threat when Van Dyke arrived. The jury deliberated for less than a day. On October 5, 2018, they found Jason Van Dyke guilty of second-degree murder and 16 counts of aggravated battery, 1 for each shot. The courtroom gasped. Chicago held its breath, waiting for violence that never came. In January 2019, Van Dyke was sentenced to 6 years and 9 months in prison, far below the 15 to 20 years prosecutors requested. The judge said he considered Van Dyke's service and lack of prior criminal record. Many felt the sentence was too lenient. Van Dyke served just over 3 years before being released in February 2022 for good behavior. He's now on parole. Laquan McDonald's family received a $5 million settlement from the city. Chicago implemented police reforms, though many argue they haven't gone far enough. 3 other officers were charged with conspiracy to cover up the shooting. They were acquitted. Jason Van Dyke is now a free man, living under an assumed identity, reportedly working in the trades. Laquan McDonald is buried at Forest Home Cemetery in Chicago. His grave is often visited, covered in flowers and messages. The video of his death remains online, a brutal reminder of what happened that night. Chicago's reputation for police misconduct endured another black eye. And the question remains, if not for that video, if not for journalists who fought to release it, would Jason Van Dyke have ever faced justice? Or would Laquan McDonald be just another statistic in a city all too familiar with violence and impunity? Number 5. Daniel Holtzclaw. Some cases are so disturbing, so fundamentally violating, that they shake your faith in the institutions meant to protect us. This is one of those cases. A police officer, sworn to serve and protect, used his badge as a weapon to prey on the most vulnerable. For months, he operated in the shadows, exploiting women who had every reason not to trust the system. And when the truth finally came out, it revealed a predator hiding in plain sight. Daniel Ken Holtzclaw was born in 1986 in Guam, where his father was stationed as a police officer in the U.S. Air Force. His mother was Japanese. The family eventually settled in Enid, Oklahoma. Daniel seemed to have a bright future. He was a star linebacker in high school, earned a football scholarship to Eastern Michigan University, and had dreams of playing professionally. When football didn't pan out, he followed in his father's footsteps. In 2011, he joined the Oklahoma City Police Department. He was assigned to the Spring Lake Division, a predominantly black low-income area. To his colleagues, Holtzclaw seemed like a decent enough cop. Quiet, a bit of a loner, but professional. He lived with his girlfriend, stayed close to his family. Nothing about him screamed danger. But behind the badge, Holtzclaw was hunting. Between December 2013 and June 2014, Holtzclaw committed a series of assaults while on duty. He targeted black women, many with criminal records or histories of substance use, women he believed wouldn't be believed if they reported him. He'd run their names for outstanding warrants, and if they had one, he'd leverage it. He'd threaten arrest unless they complied with his demands. The acts ranged from forced exposure to completed assaults, And they took place in his patrol car, in alleyways, even on the porches of victims' homes. He chose women society often ignored, those experiencing homelessness, those struggling with addiction, those with arrest records. He counted on their silence, and for a while, it worked. Several women tried to report what happened, but their complaints went nowhere initially. Then, in June 2014, a 57-year-old grandmother named Janny Ligons called 911. She had no criminal record, no reason not to be believed. Holtzclaw had pulled her over for an alleged traffic violation and forced her into compliance. She reported it immediately. Her credibility changed everything. The Oklahoma City Police Department launched an investigation. Detectives Kim Davis and Rocky Gregory began digging. They pulled Holtzclaw's GPS records from his patrol car and cross-referenced them with call logs. They identified a pattern, stops in low-income areas, often involving black women. Detectives tracked down 13 women who reported being victimized by Holtzclaw. The stories were consistent. Same tactics, same threats, same predator. In August 2014, Holtzclaw was arrested and charged with multiple felony counts. The investigation revealed he'd assaulted at least 13 women, though detectives believe there were more who never came forward. Holtzclaw maintained his innocence, claiming the women were lying, that they were criminals trying to take down a cop. His defense team would later argue that the accusations were a conspiracy. The trial began in November 2015 and lasted a month. It was emotionally devastating. Survivors took the stand and relived their trauma in front of a packed courtroom, a jury, and the man who had violated them. The prosecution presented GPS data, DNA evidence, and the testimony of 13 women. The defense attacked the victims' credibility, pointing to their criminal backgrounds and inconsistencies in their statements. It was a classic strategy. Blame the victims. But the jury saw through it. On December 10, 2015, after deliberating for 4 days, they returned their verdict. Guilty on 18 of 36 counts, including 4 counts of first-degree assault. As the verdicts were read, Holtzclaw sat stone-faced, then broke down sobbing. His family wept in the courtroom. The survivors embraced each other and the prosecutors. In January 2016, Holtzclaw was sentenced to 263 years in prison, with the sentences running consecutively. The judge called his crimes a gross abuse of power and public trust. Holtzclaw is currently serving his sentence at the Lexington Assessment and Reception Center in Oklahoma. He has maintained his innocence and filed multiple appeals, all of which have been denied. His supporters, including his family and some advocates who believe he was wrongfully convicted, continue to fight for his release. But the evidence is overwhelming, and every court that has reviewed the case has upheld the conviction. The survivors of Daniel Holtzclaw's crimes have shown extraordinary courage. Several have become advocates for others who have been victimized by those in positions of power. Oklahoma City settled civil suits with several victims. The case sparked a national conversation about police misconduct, particularly the targeting of marginalized women. It also raised questions about how Holtzclaw was able to operate for so long. Were there warning signs? Why weren't earlier complaints taken seriously? Daniel Holtzclaw will spend the rest of his life in prison. His victims will spend the rest of theirs trying to heal from what he did. And the badge he once wore, a symbol of trust and authority, became an instrument of terror in the hands of a man who saw vulnerability as opportunity. Number 6. Kimberly Potter. Imagine being a cop for over 2 decades, training countless officers, earning a reputation as calm and competent. Then, in a single chaotic moment, you make a mistake so catastrophic that it ends a life, destroys your career, and lands you in prison. That's the story of Kimberly Potter, a Minnesota police officer who claimed she confused her gun for her taser during a traffic stop, a claim that some believed and others found impossible to accept. Kimberly Ann Potter was born in 1972 and grew up in Minnesota. She was a mother of two, married for decades, and by all accounts, lived a quiet suburban life. In 1995, she joined the Brooklyn Center Police Department, a small city just north of Minneapolis. Over 26 years, she rose to the rank of sergeant and became a field training officer, responsible for mentoring new recruits. She had a clean record, no excessive force complaints, no serious disciplinary issues. Colleagues described her as professional, even-tempered, and dedicated. She was 2 years from retirement, looking forward to spending more time with her grandchildren. And then came April 11th, 2021, a day that would unravel her entire life. It was early afternoon, and Potter was training, a rookie officer. They pulled over a white Buick for expired registration and an air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror. The driver was Dante Wright, a 20-year-old black man and father of a young son. Officers ran his information and found an outstanding warrant for a weapons violation. When they tried to arrest him, Wright resisted and attempted to get back into his car. Potter shouted, "Taser! Taser! Taser!" standard protocol to alert other officers that a taser is about to be deployed. But instead of her taser, which was holstered on her left side, she drew her firearm from her right side. She fired once. Wright, struck in the chest, drove a short distance before crashing into another vehicle. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Potter, realizing what she'd done, immediately began screaming, "Oh my God, I shot him." The entire incident was captured on body camera. The shooting happened just 10 miles from where Derek Chauvin was on trial for the death of George Floyd. Minneapolis was still reeling, still on edge. The timing couldn't have been worse. Protests erupted in Brooklyn Center within hours. Hundreds took to the streets. The National Guard, already deployed for the Chauvin trial, responded. Brooklyn Center's police chief called it an accidental discharge, saying Potter mistook her gun for her taser. He resigned the next day. Potter also resigned. But resignation didn't protect her from prosecution. On April 14th, she was arrested and charged with second-degree manslaughter. The big question, was it a genuine mistake, or was it reckless disregard? The trial began in December 2021, just 8 months after Wright's death. Prosecutors argued that Potter's mistake was inexcusable. She was a veteran officer, a trainer, someone who should know the difference between a taser and a firearm. They pointed out the weight difference. Tasers are lighter, often bright yellow. Hers was holstered on the opposite side of her body. They played the body camera footage over and over, showing the chaos, but also the failure. The defense argued it was an honest mistake, a tragic error in a high-stress situation. They brought in use of force experts who testified that weapon confusion is a known phenomenon, though extremely rare. Potter herself took the stand, sobbing as she recounted the moment. She said she never intended to hurt anyone, that she was horrified when she realized what happened. Imagine being on that jury. Do you believe it was an accident, or does incompetence rise to the level of a crime? On December 23, 2021, the jury found Kimberly Potter guilty of first-degree and second-degree manslaughter. Wright's family sobbed in the courtroom. Potter showed no emotion, staring straight ahead. In February 2022, she was sentenced to 2 years in prison, below the sentencing guidelines of around 7 years. The judge said she considered Potter's remorse, her clean record, and the fact that she didn't intend to kill Wright. Many, including Wright's family, felt the sentence was far too lenient. Prosecutors had asked for 7.5 years. Potter served 16 months before being released on parole in April 2023. She's now living quietly, out of the public eye. Dante Wright's mother, Katie Wright, became an advocate for police reform and gun violence prevention. The family received a $3.2 million settlement from the city of Brooklyn Center. The city also implemented policy changes, including removing police from certain traffic stops. The case reignited debates over police training, accountability, and the use of tasers. Kimberly Potter's case is unusual. Most police shootings don't result in criminal charges, let alone convictions. But the body camera footage and her own admission of error left little room for defense. She's now a convicted felon, her legacy forever tied to a young man's death. And Daunte Wright, who had his whole life ahead of him, is buried at Calvary Cemetery in Minnesota, leaving behind a son who will grow up without a father, all because of a mistake that should never have happened. Number 7. Shaun Willoughby. Not all cases that shock the conscience involve high-profile victims or nationally televised trials. Some unfold quietly in small towns, where everyone knows everyone, and the betrayal cuts even deeper because of it. This is the story of a police officer in a tight-knit community who abused his position in the most unthinkable way, preying on a child who should have been safe. And when the truth came out, it shattered trust in a way that's hard to repair. Shaun Willoughby was a deputy with the Wayne County Sheriff's Office in Michigan. He wasn't a big city cop. He worked in the suburbs and small towns west of Detroit. He'd been on the force for years and was known in the community. He had a family, a home, a life that on the surface seemed unremarkable. But beginning around 2012, Willoughby engaged in a pattern of misconduct that would ultimately land him in prison and destroy his reputation forever. The details of the case are deeply disturbing. Willoughby targeted a young girl, someone he knew, someone who trusted him, someone who had no reason to believe a police officer would harm her. Over the course of months, he repeatedly abused her. The victim was just a child, vulnerable and confused, manipulated by someone who used his authority and position to silence her. The abuse went on for a period of time before the victim finally disclosed what was happening. Imagine the courage it took for a child to come forward, to speak up against someone in a position of power, someone adults in the community respected. When the allegations surfaced, the Wayne County Sheriff's Office launched an investigation. Detectives interviewed the victim, gathered evidence, and built a case. The details were sickening. Willoughby had used his position to gain access, to groom, to exploit. There were electronic communications, testimony, and corroborating evidence. In 2014, Willoughby was arrested and charged with multiple counts related to criminal misconduct involving a minor. The charges were serious, felonies that carried significant prison time. When the case went public, the community was stunned. How could this happen? How could someone sworn to protect and serve commit such heinous acts? Parents questioned whether their children were safe. Colleagues felt betrayed. The victim's family was devastated, not just by the abuse itself, but by the realization that they'd trusted someone who turned out to be a predator. The case moved through the court system, and the evidence against Willoughby was overwhelming. Prosecutors painted a picture of systematic abuse, of manipulation and exploitation. The defense had little to work with. The victim's testimony was credible, the evidence was damning, and Willoughby's position as a law enforcement officer only made his actions more egregious. Rather than face a trial where every detail would be laid bare in open court, Willoughby accepted a plea deal. In 2015, he pleaded guilty to multiple felony counts. The plea spared the victim from having to testify in a public trial, reliving the trauma in front of strangers. It also ensured a conviction and significant prison time. The judge, in accepting the plea, made it clear that Willoughby's abuse of his position as a police officer was an aggravating factor. He wasn't just a criminal. He was someone who had taken an oath to protect the vulnerable and had done the exact opposite. The betrayal was twofold: the abuse itself and the corruption of the badge he wore. Willoughby was sentenced to multiple decades in prison. The exact sentence reflected the severity and duration of his crimes, long enough that he'd be an old man before he'd even be eligible for parole, if at all. He's currently incarcerated in a Michigan state prison, where former law enforcement officers often face harsh treatment from other inmates. The victim, whose identity has been protected throughout, has had to live with the trauma of what Willoughby did. Counseling, therapy, and support from loved ones can help, but the scars of childhood abuse run deep. Advocates who work with survivors of abuse by authority figures say cases like this are particularly damaging because they destroy a child's ability to trust institutions meant to protect them. The Wayne County Sheriff's Office conducted an internal review to determine if there were warning signs that were missed, if Willoughby had access he shouldn't have had, if policies needed to change. The case led to discussions about background checks, ongoing monitoring of officers, and creating environments where children feel safe reporting abuse even when the abuser is someone in authority. But no policy change can undo what happened. The community had to grapple with the reality that a monster had been hiding among them, wearing a badge. Shaun Willoughby's name is now synonymous with betrayal in Wayne County. He'll spend most, if not all, of the rest of his life in prison. The child he victimized will spend the rest of hers healing from what he did. And a small community learned a painful lesson. That evil doesn't always announce itself. And sometimes the people we trust the most are the ones who hurt us the worst. Number 8. Roy Oliver. Imagine being a teenage kid at a house party, just having fun with friends when suddenly the night turns deadly. Not from gang violence, not from a crime gone wrong, but from a police officer who decided to fire into a car full of unarmed teenagers driving away. That's exactly what happened on April 29, 2017, in the Dallas suburb of Balch Springs, Texas. And the officer who pulled the trigger was Roy Oliver, a cop whose split-second decision would end a young life and land him in prison. Roy Dean Oliver Jr. was born in 1972 and grew up in Texas. He had a military background, having served in the Army, which he often cited as part of his training and discipline. He joined law enforcement and eventually became a patrol officer with the Balch Springs Police Department, a small city just southeast of Dallas. Oliver had been on the force for several years and portrayed himself as a no-nonsense cop who wasn't afraid to use force when necessary. He'd been involved in prior use of force incidents and had a reputation among some colleagues as aggressive. He was married with children and seemed like a typical suburban cop. But on that spring night in 2017, Roy Oliver would cross a line that would change multiple lives forever. It started with a noise complaint. Someone called about a house party where teenagers were drinking. Oliver and his partner, Tyler Gross, responded around 11 o'clock at night. When they arrived, the party was breaking up. Kids were leaving. There was no violence, no weapons visible, just teenagers scrambling to avoid getting in trouble. Oliver went inside the house while his partner stayed outside. Then, someone reported hearing gunshots nearby, not at the party, but in the area. The officers became more alert. Outside, a car full of teenagers was leaving the party. Inside was 15-year-old Jordan Edwards, a freshman honor student and football player, sitting in the front passenger seat. His 2 brothers and 2 friends were also in the car. The driver was trying to leave, backing up and then driving forward to exit the parking lot. Roy Oliver emerged from the house and saw the car. According to his later testimony, he believed the car was driving aggressively toward his partner, posing a threat. Tyler Gross would later testify that he never felt threatened by the vehicle. But Oliver didn't hesitate. He raised his patrol rifle, an AR-15 style weapon, and fired multiple rounds into the car as it drove away. 5 shots. The car didn't stop immediately, but inside, Jordan Edwards had been struck in the head. The driver continued for a short distance before realizing what happened and stopping. Jordan was rushed to the hospital but died shortly after arrival. He was unarmed. All the teenagers in the car were unarmed. They were just kids trying to leave a party. The initial police statement said the car was reversing aggressively toward officers, justifying Oliver's use of deadly force. But body camera footage told a different story. The car was driving forward, away from officers, when Oliver fired. There was no threat. Balch Springs Police Chief Jonathan Haber reviewed the footage and did something unusual. He publicly corrected the narrative and fired Roy Oliver within days. He called the shooting inappropriate and said it violated department policy. Oliver was arrested on May 5, 2017, just 6 days after the shooting, and charged with murder. It was a rare and swift response, likely influenced by the national scrutiny on police shootings and the clear evidence that contradicted the initial story. The trial began in August 2018, over a year after Jordan's death. Prosecutors argued that Oliver's use of force was unjustified and unreasonable. They played the body camera footage showing the car driving away, not toward officers. They brought in use of force experts who testified that shooting into a fleeing vehicle full of passengers violated every principle of reasonable force. Jordan's father, Odell Edwards, testified about his son, a good kid, an athlete, a student with a bright future. The defense argued that Oliver made a split-second decision based on what he perceived as a threat in a chaotic situation. They tried to paint him as a cop doing his job under pressure. But the jury didn't buy it. On August 28, 2018, they found Roy Oliver guilty of murder, a stunning verdict. Police officers are rarely convicted of murder for on-duty shootings, even when the facts seem damning. In August 2018, Oliver was sentenced to 15 years in prison. The jury had the option to sentence him to up to life, but they settled on 15 years. With eligibility for parole after half the sentence. Jordan Edwards' family was emotional, but relieved that there was some accountability. Oliver showed little emotion during sentencing. He's currently serving his time in a Texas state prison. His conviction was upheld on appeal. The Edwards family received a settlement from the city of Balch Springs, though no amount of money can replace their son. The Balch Springs Police Department implemented reforms, and Chief Haber, who fired Oliver, was praised for his transparency and swift action. Roy Oliver's case stands out because conviction is so rare. The body camera footage was irrefutable. The police chief didn't cover for him, and the jury, even in Texas where support for law enforcement is strong, saw through the justifications and held him accountable. Jordan Edwards was just 15. He loved football, dreamed of playing in college, and was loved by his family and friends. He never got to grow up, never got to graduate, never got to become the man he was meant to be, all because Roy Oliver made a decision in seconds that he'll pay for over decades. And a family will spend the rest of their lives asking what might have been if Jordan had just made it home that night. Number 9, Thomas Lane. Sometimes in a case that captures the world's attention, there are figures on the periphery. People who were there, who played a role, but whose culpability is debated endlessly. Were they complicit? Or were they just following orders? Did they have the power to stop what was happening, or were they trapped by hierarchy and training? Thomas Lane is one of those figures. A rookie cop who was present during one of the most notorious police killings in American history, and whose actions, or inactions, during those fatal minutes have defined the rest of his life. Thomas Kiernan Lane was born in 1993 and grew up in the Twin Cities, area of Minnesota. He studied sociology at the University of Minnesota Mankato, graduating in 2016. Unlike many officers who go straight into law enforcement, Lane worked as a correctional officer and in juvenile probation before deciding to become a police officer. In February 2020, he joined the Minneapolis Police Department. By May, he'd been on the force for just 4 days, still in his field training phase, riding with a more experienced officer to learn the job. He was 27 years old, idealistic, and by all accounts, eager to prove himself. Then came May 25th, 2020, and everything changed. Lane and his partner, J. Alexander Queng, were the first officers to respond to the call at Cup Foods about a counterfeit $20 bill. They approached George Floyd's vehicle, and Lane drew his weapon, ordering Floyd out of the car. Floyd appeared anxious, saying he was claustrophobic and didn't want to be put in the squad car. Lane and Queng struggled to get Floyd into the vehicle. That's when Derek Chauvin and Tu Thao arrived as backup. Chauvin, the senior officer, took over. He pulled Floyd out of the car and forced him to the ground, face down. Chauvin placed his knee on Floyd's neck. Lane held Floyd's legs. For over 9 minutes, they stayed in that position. Floyd said he couldn't breathe. Bystanders pleaded with the officers. And twice, Lane asked Chauvin if they should roll Floyd onto his side. Both times, Chauvin said no. Lane, the rookie, deferred to the veteran. George Floyd died. When the video went viral and protests erupted, all 4 officers were fired. Lane, along with Queng and Thao, was charged with aiding and abetting second-degree murder and manslaughter. The question was whether Lane's actions, or his failure to intervene, made him criminally responsible. Lane's defense attorneys argued that he was a brand new officer, that he'd questioned Chauvin twice, that he was caught in an impossible situation where going against a senior officer could end his career. Prosecutors countered that Lane had a duty to intervene, that his oath to protect life superseded his obedience to a superior, and that his inaction contributed to Floyd's death. The debate over Lane's culpability became a microcosm of larger questions about police culture, hierarchy, and the blue wall of silence. In February 2022, Lane accepted a plea deal on the state charges. He pleaded guilty to aiding and abetting second-degree manslaughter in exchange for prosecutors dropping the murder charge. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison, significantly less than Chauvin's sentence, but still a felony conviction. The plea deal also required him to testify against the other officers if needed. Then came the federal charges. Lane, along with Queng and Thao, was charged with violating George Floyd's civil rights, specifically failing to intervene and failing to provide medical care. In July 2022, all 3 were convicted on federal charges. In July 2023, Lane was sentenced to 2.5 years in federal prison to be served concurrently with his state sentence. Thomas Lane is currently serving his time in a federal facility. He'll be eligible for release after serving about 2/3 of his sentence, likely in late 2024 or early 2025. Unlike Chauvin, who is universally reviled, Lane has received some sympathy from people who believe he was a scapegoat, a rookie cop in the wrong place at the wrong time, who questioned authority but didn't push hard enough. Others see him as complicit, someone who could have saved a life if he'd just acted with courage instead of deference. His attorneys have argued that the prosecution of Lane and the other junior officers was about optics, about holding someone accountable when the system had failed for so long. George Floyd's family has made it clear they believe all 4 officers bear responsibility. Lane's sentence, while lighter than Chauvin's, still reflects the jury's belief that his failure to act contributed to Floyd's death. The case has been used in police training across the country as an example of the duty to intervene, of the need for officers to speak up even when it's uncomfortable, even when it goes against hierarchy. But in the moment, on that street in Minneapolis, Lane didn't do enough, and now he's paying the price. Thomas Lane's life will forever be tied to those 9 minutes and 29 seconds. He was there, he questioned, but he didn't act. And for George Floyd, Those questions without action meant the difference between life and death. Lane will eventually walk out of prison. Floyd never got that chance. Number 10. Brett Hankison. In the chaos and tragedy of March 13, 2020, one name echoed alongside Breonna Taylor's in the national outcry that followed: Brett Hankison. While other officers involved in the raid that killed Taylor faced federal charges, Hankison's story is unique. He was the only one criminally charged at the state level initially, not for Taylor's death directly, but for what prosecutors called wanton endangerment. His case became a flashpoint in the debate over police accountability, raising the question: when officers fire blindly into an apartment, who pays the price, and what does justice look like? Brett Hankison was born in 1980 and grew up in Kentucky. He joined the Louisville Metro Police Department in 2003, spending 17 years on the force. He worked as a plainclothes officer in various units, including narcotics and special investigations. Colleagues described him as aggressive, ambitious, and willing to push boundaries. By 2020, he'd been involved in multiple use-of-force incidents and had faced internal complaints, though none resulted in serious discipline. He lived in the Louisville area, was known to frequent bars and social spots, and seemed to enjoy the adrenaline of high-risk police work. To some, he was a cop willing to do what others wouldn't. To others, he was reckless, a cowboy with a badge. On the night of March 13, 2020, Hankison was part of a team executing a no-knock warrant at Breonna Taylor's apartment. The warrant was connected to a narcotics investigation involving Taylor's ex-boyfriend, who police believed was using her address to receive drugs, a claim that was later disputed. Officers used a battering ram to break down the door shortly after midnight. Inside, Taylor and her boyfriend, Kenneth Walker, were in bed. Walker, believing they were being robbed, fired one shot with his legally owned firearm, striking an officer in the leg. Police returned fire. Officers Jonathan Mattingly and Miles Cosgrove fired from the doorway. But Hankison did something different. He moved to the side of the building and fired 10 rounds blindly through Taylor's sliding glass door, which was covered by blinds and curtains. He couldn't see what he was shooting at. Some of his bullets went through Taylor's apartment and penetrated the wall into a neighboring unit, where a family with a child was sleeping. Miraculously, no one in that apartment was hit. Breonna Taylor, however, was struck multiple times and died at the scene. She was 26 years old, an EMT, and unarmed. The aftermath was explosive. Protests erupted not just in Louisville, but nationwide. Taylor's name became a rallying cry alongside George Floyd's. The Louisville Metro Police Department launched an investigation, and the FBI got involved. What they found was troubling. The warrant was based on questionable information. Taylor's apartment contained no drugs, and Hankison's blind shooting was deemed not just dangerous, but indefensible. In June 2020, he was fired from the department. The termination letter stated he displayed an extreme indifference to the value of human life and violated department policy by wantonly and blindly firing into the apartment. But firing wasn't enough for those demanding accountability. The question was whether he'd face criminal charges. In September 2020, a grand jury indicted Hankison, not for Taylor's death, but for 3 counts of wanton endangerment for firing into the neighboring apartment. The decision infuriated protesters and Taylor's family. No one was charged with killing Breonna. The message seemed clear. The bullets that endangered white neighbors mattered more than the ones that killed a black woman. Hankison pleaded not guilty. His trial began in February 2022. His defense argued that he believed his fellow officers were under fire and that he was acting to protect them. The prosecution argued he violated every rule of firearms safety and department policy. The jury deliberated for 3 days. The result? Not guilty on all 3 counts. The courtroom erupted. Taylor's family was devastated. protesters returned to the streets. But the legal saga didn't end there. In August 2022, federal prosecutors charged Hankison and 3 other officers with civil rights violations related to Taylor's death. Hankison was specifically charged with using excessive force by firing blindly. The federal trial took place in November 2023. This time, the jury had more context, testimony about the warrant, the raid, and Hankison's actions. On November 1st, 2024, after more than 20 hours of deliberation, the jury found Hankison guilty of violating Breonna Taylor's civil rights by using excessive force. It was the first conviction of any officer involved in the raid. In March 2025, he was sentenced to 16 years in federal prison, one of the longest sentences ever imposed on a police officer for excessive force. The judge called his actions shocking to the conscience. Brett Hankison is currently serving his sentence in federal custody. The other officers involved faced mixed outcomes. Mattingly retired, Cosgrove was fired but not charged, and Joshua Janes, who secured the warrant, was convicted of civil rights violations. Breonna Taylor's family received a $12 million settlement from the city of Louisville, and her name now graces legislation aimed at banning no-knock warrants, but no amount of money or policy change brings her back. Hankison's conviction was a rare moment of accountability in a system that often shields its own. Yet for many, it came too late and didn't go far enough. Brett Hankison fired 10 shots into a home where he couldn't see his target. One of those bullets took Breonna Taylor's life. Now he'll spend the next decade and a half in prison, while Taylor's family continues to mourn a daughter, a sister, a woman whose life was stolen in the middle of the night by those who were supposed to protect and serve.